Wizard of Legend is a roguelike action game from Contingent 99 that's all about high-paced, intense combat. It's an incredibly rewarding game because of its high-skill design. When you finally beat that boss or level that's been kicking your ass over and over, it just feels so damn satisfying. Now the game begins with you visiting the museum of past wizards and all their heroic trials, only to be chosen to do the chaos trials yourself to determine if you'll become a Wizard of Legend. Really, the story is pretty much irrelevant, really just an excuse to get you into the Chaos Trials, which is a roguelike dungeon. Now, the game itself is broken into 3 different sections with 3 levels in each section. Now, each section carries a different theme, like Earth, Fire, or Ice, and then come in different orders. So the first time you play, you might get Earth, Fire, and Ice. The next time you might get Ice, Fire, and Earth, or something like that. Each section is broken into 3 levels. You'll play 2 dungeon crawler levels that play out just like a roguelike dungeon, so you'll run around, you'll fight different monsters, trying to find your way out. There'll be certain NPCs along the way that you can either buy new spells or equipment at, or purchase certain upgrades from. Each dungeon crawler level has its own mini boss at the end that's completely randomized, so you can get things like an archer that's really strong, or a knight that's really strong, or a mage that's really strong. Then at the end of each section, so after you beat 2 dungeon crawler levels, you'll get a boss. So do that 3 times for each of the different themes, Earth, Fire, and Ice, and then you'll fight a final boss at the end of the game. It's a decent system that keeps the game feeling fresh and not repetitive, despite the fact that there really isn't a lot of content there, only being 3 different theme types. You'll be able to equip yourself with 1 item and a cloak and 4 spells before entering each Chaos Trials, and as you complete the different levels, you'll gain gold, which you can use to buy new spells, growing your total to 6 spells in total throughout the Chaos Trials, or buy yourself a different cloak, or buying new items to enhance your abilities. These items can be pretty interesting. There's a lot of them that have all sorts of different crazy effects, from simple things like buffing damage. You can also get really interesting cursed relics, such as the Horned Halo, which will give you a second life, but it'll reduce your health in half from the beginning. Or you can get things that'll turn you into a glass cannon that'll reduce your health but make your damage a lot more powerful. There's a lot of just interesting ways you can really mix and match each playthrough to be totally unique and different. There's also a ton of different spells in this game, and they're all sorts of different categories. You can get things like flame spells, water spells, like throwing fireballs, or grabbing enemies with a torrent of water, or grappling enemies with your fists through earth powers, or using electricity to shock your opponents, or using wind to gather them up so that you can clump them to use AoE spells. There's just a lot of customization here to really customize each mage to be how you want it to play. There is a couple repeats, like for example, both water and electricity have a spear that you can generate to throw at people, but they do have slight differences. Like the electric one will bounce off and ricochet to different enemies from the one that you just hit, whereas the water one will impale an enemy against a wall. Overall, I think the spells are fantastically done and really allow you to build the hero that you want, whether you be a ranged or melee character, or an aggressive character, or more defensive character. You can really play a wizard just how you want. And this game does a fantastic job at really making you feel like a really powerful wizard with some super cool abilities. There is also a sense of progress as each time you complete the game, or if you fail, you'll gain points that you can use to buy new items, spells, and cloaks to start each new Chaos Trial, which does give you an incentive even if you fail to keep playing. You'll gain new spells and abilities and ways to customize your character so you can go further in each trial. Now there's a few areas that Wizards of Legend does stumble in its gameplay. So first off, you've got the lack of diversity in the locations and enemies. Each of the 3 areas, Ice, Fire, and Earth, is more or less just kind of a reskin of one another. The enemies are slightly different with a few different attacks. For, say, an Ice Mage, for example, that might freeze you versus a Fire Mage that throws fireballs, but it all kind of just feels the same after you've been playing the game for a while. It's all the same thing. You'll be fighting mages, knights, and archers. Just the same stuff over and over again. And there's really only a handful of monsters in the dungeon crawler section. You've got your knights, your mages, your golems, and your archers, and there's just a few other things sprinkled in there. It's really only a handful of monsters, and as a result, it can get kind of boring after a while. It can also be pretty hard when it comes to the RNG aspect of the game. So for the mini-bosses, for example, they can be one of a number of different mini-bosses that you'll fight at the end of each dungeon crawler section. But if you're unfortunate enough to get, say, a burst mage, for example, in stage 3, it is significantly more difficult than if you were to get, say, just the knight mini-boss in stage 3 compared to its stage 1 counterparts. The burst mage in particular is just super strong in Stage 3, and that can really ratchet up the difficulty in the game. Another problem is that some of the side content of the dungeons doesn't feel like it really adds much. For example, there's a number of shops like Nox the Unfortunate who offers cursed relics that usually have a downside and an upside to them. You could get something like the Horned Halo, which halves your current health but gives you a second life in exchange. Most of the time, the 3 items he offered just didn't really feel relevant to my particular build, and as a result, his whole thing is kind of pointless. There's also Dr. Song, where you give her a card and she'll give you a random buff. There's also Nocturne the Cardist, who takes one of your spells and mixes them in with 4, and then gives you the choice of 4 different spells to pick. None of these really felt like they really added to the game at all, and kind of just felt like they were taking space. Now, as far as the graphics go, even in its simplicity with the sort of pixely look to it, it looks really good, and it actually is very pleasing to watch. The soundtrack of this game is really good as well. It's pretty engaging and upbeat, and it's really catchy in particular. You'll be humming it and whistling it constantly, but it does lack a bit of variety. You'll be hearing the same tracks over and over again because there's just not enough of them. And as a result, I began to start wanting to turn the music off around the 8 or so hour mark of the game. Overall, Wizards of Legend is a really charming game that has a lot to love. As a fan of Avatar: The Last Airbender, this game really does feel like living a Bender fantasy with so many different spells and items to customize your wizard however you want. It really lets you take ownership over the game. Its biggest fault is the fact that it's very repetitive. With the music and the enemies and locations, it just become dull after a while. It begins to all kind of blend together and feel the same after about 6 or so hours. But even at that, Wizards of Legend gets a 7 out of 10. It's a pretty fun game that I would recommend. And for the $11 I got it at the Steam sale, it was a pretty good value.